In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to knit the Deep Shadow sock heel, which is a new, as far as I'm aware, sock heel that I developed based on Alice Yu's Shadow Wrap sock heel. I developed this heel because I was looking for a way to make a contrast color heel that made a nice sort of triangle here and that could be worked at the same time rather than like an afterthought heel where you knit a tube and then add in the heel. And I wanted that sock heel to fit as well as a more traditional heel flap and gusset sock heel. I just find that a regular short row sock heel doesn't quite give me the depth I want across this part of the foot, sort of diagonally across the widest part of the heel and ankle. So I wanted a way to add in a bit more depth there, and I really like how a traditional gusset gradually slopes down and follows the shape of the foot. So I wanted to achieve that. Did a lot of testing. I think I've knit about 40 sock heels in the last few months. I did a lot of testing of different short row methods. I didn't start out tied to the Shadow Wrap method. It was just the method that ended up working the best for this. And it's basically, I've adapted it so that the first half of the heel is more or less the same as any other short row sock heel. If you're familiar with one, you're gradually knitting rows that get shorter and shorter across half of your stitches for the heel. Each row is one stitch shorter than the previous one, and you're working a short row method at the end of each row so that when you work back across those stitches, you don't end up with holes. The second half, however, you're also working rows that get longer and longer, you're kind of mirroring the shape you made on the first half, but what you end up with is 2 stitches for every 1 stitch that went into a turn at the beginning. And you do a bit of like fancy work with slipping stitches and increasing and decreasing to make sure that, again, those are really nicely kind of woven together. You don't have gaps here. On the inside, you can kind of see there's almost like a seam effect. So that gives you something that when you wear it, it doesn't stretch and create holes. It looks really nice and smooth. And then those extra stitches are then decreased out with a sort of traditional gusset to get you back down to your original stitch count. So this is the Shadow Print sock pattern. It's available in my Knitworthy 8 collection. It's currently exclusive to the collection, but will be available as an individual pattern, I think mid-December. And if you are interested in like a plain vanilla version of the Deep Shadow heel as a written pattern, do let me know in the comments, because that is something I'm considering and I'd love to know if that's something you're interested in. But I have tried to make this tutorial so that you can use it as reference for the Shadow Print sock pattern or as a substitute heel for any other sock pattern that you might be working on. And one of the nice things about this method, like the Shadow Wrap sock, the original Shadow Wrap sock method, is that there's not a lot of counting involved. It's very easy to see what you're doing, so it's very easy to substitute into patterns with different gauges or different stitch counts. And I'm going to show you on a sort of DK worsted weight, just because it makes it easier for you to see what's going on, and the method is exactly the same if you're using a traditional sock weight yarn as well. The heel is worked back and forth on half of the stitches. I'm working with Magic Loop, but you can translate this to DPNs or to circulars, whichever you prefer. You just want to make sure you have half of the stitches sort of separated in half, just hanging out. With Magic Loop, I've just got the sort of non-heel stitches hanging out on the cable of my needle. If I was using DPNs, I tend to prefer to put all of my heel stitches onto one needle and leave the rest of the stitches divided over 2 needles. But you can also have the heel stitches split over 2 needles. It's up to you how you want to do that. I'm going to show you how to work the heel with a contrast color yarn, partly because it's easier to see it, and I really like how this heel looks worked in a contrast color yarn. But if you want to make a plain vanilla sock all in one color, you absolutely can. You can just follow this and ignore the parts about dealing with a second color. I'm going to start by knitting the first stitch in my main color, my gray, and then I'm going to take my contrast color, this golden yellow, and add it in And then I'm going to knit across until there are 2 stitches left on this half of the sock on the heel stitches. And then we're going to create our first twin stitch by working a right leaning lifted increase in this next stitch. So to do that, I'm going to go into the stitch below the stitch on the left needle and pick up this right leg, pop it onto my left needle, and then knit into this new loop. And then to create my to complete my twin stitch, I'm going to slip this new stitch back to my left needle tip. So that gives me 2 stitches coming out of this one stitch. Then I'm going to turn my work, and I like to give everything a bit of a tug to make that nice and neat. And then I'm going to purl back across until I have 2 stitches left, or 1 stitch before my first stitch worked in this yellow color. So we've got 2 stitches left here, and then we're basically going to do the exact same thing as we did on the right side. Increase in the stitch below this stitch, and then slip it back to the left needle. So I'm going to work an right leaning lifted increase purl. So just to show you that again, I'm picking up this stitch below the current stitch with my right needle tip and placing it on the left needle, and then I'm purling into that and then slipping it back to my left needle. And that, if I pull it a bit tighter, and we've got our tail loosening it up a bit here too, you can see I've got my twin stitch now here on my left needle. So then I'm going to turn and knit back across until I've got 1 stitch before my twin stitch. I've got 1 stitch left before my twin stitch. The nice thing about this short row method is that it's very easy to spot the twin stitches. So it's easy to tell kind of where you are to orientate yourself. So I've got my twin stitch here. I can see I've got 2 loops coming out of this 1 stitch. So 1 stitch before it is here, and then I'm going to repeat creating a twin stitch exactly the same as I did this first right side one. So I'll show you that again. I'm going to work on right leaning lifted increase. So I'm picking up this first leg of the stitch below the stitch on my left needle, placing it on the needle tip, and then knitting into it. That gives me a new stitch, which I'm going to slip to my left needle. There's my twin stitch, and then I'm going to turn, purl back across, and make another twin stitch on the wrong side. So I've got 1 stitch here before my twin stitch on the wrong side. So I'm going to work another increase. So picking up this stitch with my left needle, and then purling into it to make my new stitch, and then slipping that new stitch to my left needle. So there, I've got my twin stitch here and then another one here. And you want to continue in that way so that you have a set of twin stitches on each side, and each one is like stepped in by 1 stitch from the last. So this right side row, I'm going to knit until I have 1 stitch before my last twin stitch. So I'll knit to here and then work my twin stitch in this stitch. And continue in that way until you have your desired number of stitches in the center of the heel. End with a wrong side twin stitch and then turn your work, and you can have as many stitches kind of left over in the middle, that means like between the most recent 2 twin stitches, as you want for the heel, depending on the fit you want. But a good general rule is about 1/3 of the stitches. I have 26 stitches across my total heel here, which doesn't really divide by 3, but it's 8 2/3. So because that's an even number, I'm going to want an even number in the center, so I'm going to go with 8 stitches. So just to double check, I have 8. So my last right side twin stitch was here. So counting from after that, I've got 2, 4, 6, 8. That's perfect. And now we're going to start basically making longer short rows for our second half of the heel. and we're going to resolve these twin stitches to prevent gaps. And this is where this really differs from a standard short row heel. With the deep shadow heel, we're going to end up with more stitches than we started with. We're going to end up with 2 stitches for every one of these, the sort of single stitches that our twin stitches were worked out of. And that means that we're going to be making new twin stitches at the same time as resolving our previous ones. And doing all of that just helps prevent there being any holes at those turning points. So what I'm going to do is knit until I'm right at my twin stitch from the previous right side row. And then we're going to knit the first stitch. So it's quite easy to see which of the twin stitches is first on the needle. So I'm going to knit that just like any other stitch. And then I'm going to make basically a new twin stitch or a new daughter out of the same mother stitch. So out of the stitch below the next one on the needle, I'm going to make a new stitch out of it. But this time we're going to work our new stitch on the other side of it. So to do that, we're going to move this stitch out of the way. We're going to slip that purlwise with the yarn in back. And then I'm going to work a left leaning lifted increase. Usually when you do a left leaning lifted increase, it's 2 rows below the stitch on your right needle tip. But because we haven't actually worked this stitch here, it's just going to be the stitch below that. So it's the same stitch as it would have been if we'd knit this stitch. So I'm picking that up. I find it easiest to pick it up with my left needle tip and then knitting into it. And that's made a new twin stitch. And then I'm going to slip both of those stitches back to my left needle. And then I'm going to turn my work again and purl back until I'm just at the twin stitch, at the last twin stitch on the wrong side. And then we're basically going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to purl my first twin stitch just as normal, or the first stitch of the pair of twins. And then I'm going to make a new stitch. So I'm going to slip this stitch. Again, purlwise, my yarn is at the wrong side. It's where it is, not moving it. And then I'm picking up the stitch below the one on the needle and purling into it. That gives me my new twin stitch, and I'm going to slip both to my left needle, turn the work, make sure everything's nice and snug, and then I'm going to knit to my next twin stitch. And this twin stitch will be like my newly created, my sort of second level twin stitch that I made on my previous row. So that's this one here. You can kind of see the difference a little bit on where the yarn of that first stitch in it is coming from compared to the next ones. And then I'm going to resolve this, prevent a hole by working a decrease to join these 2 stitches together. So I'm going to do a slip slip knit, a left leaning decrease. So I'm going to slip both of those individual stitches of the pair. Just careful not to split this yarn. I'm going to slip both knitwise and then insert my left needle through them and knit together. So that's resolving my new kind of newly created twin stitch, and then I've got my next of my original twin stitches, and I'm going to treat this the same as I did the previous one, so on the previous row. So I'm going to knit the first stitch and then make a new twin stitch out of the remaining one. So knit one and then slip this next stitch purlwise and work a left leaning lifted increase. That gives me my new stitch. Slip that and the original stitch back to the left needle. I've got my new twin stitch here, and then I'm going to purl back. So I'm purling back until I get to my last twin stitch on the wrong side. And again, this is my newly created twin stitch, and on the wrong side I'm simply going to purl those 2 together. So treat them as one stitch, purl them together, And then I've got another twin stitch. This is one of my original kind of level ones. So I'm going to purl the first stitch of the pair and then make a new stitch to join the second one. So I'm slipping it, working my left leaning increase. It gives me my new twin stitch, slipping those together back to my left needle and turning, and continue like that. So I'm going to knit to my twin stitch. That'll be a new twin stitch. So I'm working a decrease and then I'll make another twin stitch from my original one. Continue repeating those 2 rows until you only have 1 twin stitch left on each side, and that's one newly created twin stitch. So I've just done my wrong side row and I've just made my new twin stitch. I definitely don't have any more here. If I check my right side, I've got, let's turn it over, I've got 1 twin stitch here, only 1, so I'm done. And then to complete my heel, you'll notice I haven't slipped my new twin stitch to my left needle. I'm not going to. I'm going to turn everything. And then, because I'm working with contrast color, I'm going to drop my contrast color at this point. And then I'm going to pick up my main color. I'm going to bring it under the tail of my contrast color. So I just want to leave that end of my contrast color over it just to kind of connect those. And then I'm going to work a knit 2 together to join this twin stitch. So knit that twin stitch as it was 1 stitch and give both ends of my contrast color yarn a nice tug now to make sure everything's nicely sort of resolved, there aren't any holes. And then I'm going to knit across until I get to my twin stitch that was made on the right side. So I've just got my twin stitch left on this side, and now I'm going to kind of join that as I have before. I'm going to work an SSK. That resolves that twin stitch. I don't have any twin stitches left, and my heel is now complete, or the heel itself is complete, I should say. So you can see we've kind of got this, if I slide this onto the needles, we've got this extra pocket. It's kind of turning everything at a right angle, and you can probably see quite clearly that I've got more stitches, is a bit roomier than the number of stitches across here that I started with, or the number of stitches on the kind of foot side of my sock I have here. So if I kind of turn it, you can maybe see here how this is starting to look like it's shaping up into a sock. And that's the heel itself complete. But then my next step, where I have those extra stitches, so I have an extra stitch for every turning point, where I have those extra stitches, my next step is to decrease out those stitches with some gusset decreases. If you've made a like a traditional top-down sock with a heel flap, then this gusset should be very familiar to you. If not, I'll give you a quick overview of how to do that. I've worked another plain round after the round in which I sort of started knitting the round again and resolved my final twin stitches. So I'm gonna do my first gusset decreases now, and at this side at the beginning of the round, just before the heel, I'm going to work a left leaning decrease. So I'm going to do a slip slip knit, and then I'm going to knit all the way across to the other side of my heel stitches until I've got just 2 stitches left. Maybe now it makes more sense to refer to these as the sole stitches, since that's where they'll be on the sock when it's finished. I've got 2 stitches left on my sole stitches. So now I'm just going to do a right leaning decrease at the knit 2 together for my gusset shaping on this side. And then I'm going to knit across the other half of my stitches that'll go across the top of the foot. and then I'll do a plain round and then repeat my gusset decrease round and continue in that way until the stitches on the sole are back to the original stitch count. I have the same number on the sole and the top of the foot. This will make a fairly short gusset. You can space those decreases out a bit more. You could do 2 plain rounds in between, 3, just see what gives you the kind of slope you like. But I would start with just decreasing every other round and see if you're happy with that, or if you want to adjust anything for your particular anatomy, your preferred fit. Here's the completed gusset. So you can see how the decreases form a diagonal line. And now there's an even number of stitches on both the top and bottom of the foot. And if you compare this to a regular short row sock heel, however the short rows are worked, you'll find that this kind of length here, the depth, is a bit longer. You've got a bit more of a diagonal across here. There's more width there, which equates to just more space to wrap around your foot, kind of diagonally at the heel. And that works well whether you have more depth there. If you find regular short row heels or afterthought heels are just a bit tight, then the deep shadow heel might work really well for you. And this is with the gusset decreases worked every other round. That is quite a short gusset. You can certainly adapt that. On the shadow print socks, you can see the gusset is a bit longer. It doesn't have more decreases. The decreases are spaced out a bit more. You can kind of see that diagonal line continues about halfway down the foot before the decreases stop. And that was mostly how the stitch pattern worked out, rather than anything really to do with the actual fit and shaping, but it maybe follows the shape of your foot more, so that is something that you can play around with. And yeah, so this is the deep shadow heel. This is the shadow print sock, which you can find in my Knitworthy 8 collection. It's currently exclusive to the collection and will be available as an individual pattern in mid-December. If you're interested in a sort of written up vanilla sock pattern for the deep shadow heel, do let me know in the comments, because I am considering sort of turning that into an actual pattern, and I would love to know if that's something that you're interested in. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and I will be back soon with another project or tutorial.